Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. I have a question. Do your students ever struggle with asking great questions that help them to guide their independent inquiry? Yeah, me too. They struggle a lot with that idea. And tonight we're going to be looking at questioning in inquiry and how to get your students ready so that they can dig deeper through those questions so that they can start getting into their independent inquiry. So hi everybody, I am Patty and I am the 4-5 teacher and teacher blogger behind Madly Learning, and this is Teaching with Inquiry Live, Center of Inquiry, and it's about how we make those questions work for us and to help them work for our students. And there's a variety of different questions and questioning type behavior that you can use in the classroom that is going to get your students ready to dig a little bit deeper. One of the biggest things that happen is when inquiry doesn't work because of those questions is because we're often asking our students to do too much too soon, and they might not have the necessary background knowledge or experiences in order to dig deeper. If I had asked you to go dig deeper on a topic about chemistry, you might not, unless you have a chemistry background, you might not even know where to start. So some of your questions before you even get started, before you can ask those really big, meaningful, universal questions, you might need to know a little bit about chemistry before you get started. Well, the same is said for our students. Now, we're not talking about Genius Hour where students get to pick whatever it is that they're interested in. We're talking about using inquiry to cover curriculum expectations, often where the curriculum is given to us and we're told what themes need to be covered for each grade level. So when that happens, you can use inquiry, but they might not necessarily have a lot of background knowledge, especially when they're talking about history. There's not a lot of 9 and 10-year-olds that might have a great sense of background knowledge when it comes to history, or for that matter, even science. They just might not have a lot of background knowledge. Some of the themes they may have a little bit more, but probably not at the scientific level. So right away, asking them to dig deeper and to think deeply about what it is that you're trying to do might be a little bit too soon. If you do that too soon, chances are you might be setting yourself and your students up for less than stellar type of inquiry experiences, which is unfortunate because you can do such amazing things with inquiry. So let's look at why we question. So questions are the center of inquiry and why we have questions. So I look at, there's 4 different types of questions that might happen when you start a learning unit with your students. And those kind of questions, you are asking questions in order to activate the students' background knowledge and get them excited, that hook that you might want to use with your students, where you might be giving them provocations and asking them to ask questions. These are often maybe lower level questions where it's just really knowledge building and some understanding, a little bit of thinking, but you're really probably not getting into a lot of deep thought. You may every once in a while, but in my experience, those deeper questions don't often start too soon. So you really start at the beginning with just activating their knowledge. Now, because we're given themes, it's almost like a murder mystery. So if you think about, you're given clues and you have to follow those clues and then you get to a certain point. The same kind of thing happens when you're using questioning to activate their knowledge. You give them those provocations, you set them up, and you're not telling them where they're going or what they're doing, but you're kind of guiding them through. And there's a lot of teacher questions that you use at this point as well, because you're using your own questioning in order to help guide them through. Now, you're also guiding them with their questions. You also need to use reflection questions because learning happens when there's a lot of reflection, and you also want to dig deeper. So if you are using questioning as part of the getting started, so you're getting started with inquiry, you're activating that prior knowledge, you want to build on a student's natural tendency for curiosity. So most students are pretty curious, especially when you're looking at the 9, 10-year-old range, and you get into some of the older grades and perhaps it's a little bit less curiosity, just that basic curiosity, but you're starting to get into, they're passionate about certain topics, or they can become passionate about certain topics when you present the information to them. So you want to build on that passion and curiosity by giving them the provocation materials that might get them to think. Not just giving them things that they might recognize, giving them things that might associate to the theme or topic that you're covering. So for instance, if I'm teaching about human body, I will often give them a stick and some grapes. Well, what does that have to do with the human body? Well, often you use, when you're talking about the lungs, you're talking about branches and grapes being similar to parts of lungs. So using those and having those associations that students can develop, that definitely wonder, why is there a picture of lungs and a picture of grapes and a picture of a stick? It's a little bit of a stretch, but it definitely gets them thinking, what is she doing? Why does she have these things here? And if you can spark that kind of, what is she doing? Why is she putting this stuff here? Then you're onto something. I often like to use a cue chart to help me and help my students construct those types of questions. Now, this often requires me doing a little bit of pre-teaching about how to use the cue chart and the different kinds of questions. And I also look at the cue chart and I look at 3 different types of questions that can be created from that cue chart. I look at thin questions, thick questions, and hot questions. So your thin questions are your knowledge and understanding, your who is, what does, when did, the one-word answers, the simple answers that students can find. Now, those are important questions that happen at the beginning of inquiry because they do need to just gather that basic information and kind of get their footing. So they're going to need to ask those thin questions. They're not probably going to start an inquiry project because of those thin questions, but they definitely need to kind of get their footing and their basis so that they can begin something. Remember, think about if you were writing something about chemistry, you might want to get a bit of background knowledge and ask those simple questions to kind of get an idea of what the parameters are before you dig a little bit deeper. I also look at thick questions. These are questions where you might have to find the information in multiple sources. There might be a more complex type of answer to these questions. You're looking at questions that provide a little bit of thinking, maybe a little bit of an opinion, but it's mostly based on facts, but it's a bit more in depth in terms of your answer. Now, your hot questions, we're going to be talking about later in tonight's episode, but we're going to be talking about those hot questions because those are the key that you're going to focus on for independent inquiry, but those aren't often happening at this getting started stage. So you want to be looking at these questions and recording their questions. And this is the key. When you're doing this, this gives you an idea of what your lines of inquiry are going to be. There's always that moment when you have questions and you have these provocation materials where you're going to see students gravitating to certain objects more than others, asking certain questions, showing interest. They might get excited about something. They might have some background knowledge about something, or looking for those sparks and making note of those sparks is really important. So you have to listen to their questioning and look for themes in what they're questioning about. You have to look for their sparks, their interest, what their background knowledge already is. So while they're doing this provocation, or I always use a wonder wall activity, if you're using this provocation, it's great if you have a clipboard with you and you are kind of making notes about what students are interested in and what they might be passionate about. So again, you're a mystery solver. So you're getting your students to be the detectives, but you're not telling them all the answers, you're not giving them all the information, but you certainly are helping them lead the way. You're letting them find the answer on their own. And it made me think, when I was thinking about this topic, it made me think of Dumbledore and Harry Potter. Dumbledore knew a lot of the answers, but Harry had to figure it out on his own. And Dumbledore was there whenever Harry needed him, and he was always there. But Harry had to figure out a lot of that on his own, but he wasn't really alone. He also had friends, and he learned from others. And I think that's another key, is learning from other people, not just from the teacher, but listening and having those connections. And that leads right into what happens in the middle of inquiry. So in the middle, when you're in the thick of it and you're doing your experiments and you're doing different activities and you're starting to answer some of those questions from the beginning, and you're starting to follow those lines of inquiry and figuring out what you can to answer some of those initial questions and then developing more, there is a cycle that you go through. And that cycle includes questioning, learning something, and then reflecting on it. And I think the reflection piece is huge. Students need to be able to question what it is they did and what they learned. When they reflect on their learning, it helps them to consolidate what it is that they're thinking about. So you really want them to be thinking and learning from one another, and then reflecting on what they're learning, and then continuing that cycle over and over again. You want to let them in, and you also want to let them lead a little bit. So starting off lessons or knowledge building circles with what it is, the goal of today, what it is you're trying to discover, what you're looking for, giving them the keys to the kingdom. They need to know what it is they're doing. They're the ones that are learning, so give them that purpose to what it is you're answering and what you're working on, so that they can be looking for that when they're doing your activity. And then when they're done, reflect on it. And not simply just an exit card. An exit card is great for teacher assessment. And we definitely want to do a little bit of both. We need to pick up that assessment piece in terms of what are students learning along the way and get all that assessment for learning. We also want them to share their learning with others, because we have a community of learners and we learn from one another. So getting them to share what they learned and asking questions from other people, figuring out what it is they've collectively learned, and then coming up with new questions that will help guide our future lessons. It's also really important for you at this point to be the questioner yourself. You're not necessarily doing all of the talking, but you are leading those discussions through tons of questioning. So even though you know the answer, and you really have to kind of bite your tongue and stop yourself from answering the questions that you know it's going to take less time if you just answer their questions. But then they start to turn their brains off. So you really want to try to ask a question that will help lead them to the answer that they can find. So you want to try to use your own questioning skills to help lead them in the direction that they want to go. So I think that this is something that is important for the teacher to remember, that our job primarily is that of questioner and inquiry as opposed to teller. So it often will feel like you aren't really teaching. In my mind, I know I always feel like teaching means I need to stand up and lecture. And that is just kind of the stereotypical vision of a teacher. In fact, even when you look at photos, like stock photos, internet photos, you often will see the teacher in front with students in rows. But that's just not what my classroom typically looks like. And I think it's what not very many typical classrooms look like at all these days. And I think that that's okay to kind of shake that off about what it is to look like a teacher and to be a teacher. And it's less about us telling and imparting knowledge on students, and way more about us questioning and helping to get them there on their own. And of course, sometimes they can't get there on their own. There is a time where you're going to hit that line where you just need to kind of tell them and help them out, because that's definitely a part of that. We still have that role. But asking questions like, how are these connected? What might happen if this and that happen? How might this person feel versus that person feel? What would this be different? And what I find is, after a couple of times with your students doing these kind of activities where you're constantly asking questions, they might get a little annoyed that all you do is ask questions. I kind of make it a fun game that's just my job, is to ask questions. I'm really explicit about my job as the questioner. But I also notice too that as you do more and more of this, students start internalizing that model that you've been modeling for them, and they themselves start questioning each other. And it allows you to take further and further steps out of the conversation and let your students take the lead, which is a really amazing thing to do when you can watch the knowledge building circle happen, where you have very little input and you're just kind of there to keep peace, really. It's definitely a strange sensation. And finally, when you finally are ready to get them to do independent inquiry, because they've now got those thin questions, they've got some understanding about the big ideas and the things that related to those themes, then they are ready to pick and narrow down a topic. But it's not just giving them the overall curriculum theme and then saying, okay, guys, pick something that interests you and go. I think you still need to scaffold it a little bit more for them and lead them a little bit more into what it is to get to that specific inquiry question. And really those questions that they're discovering more about through inquiry are really specific. And often I find students get so broad and want to talk about this big, broad idea, and there's so much information that they have a really difficult time narrowing it down. So helping them through conferencing to get really specific about what it is that they want, I think is a good idea. So the process that I use is first looking at those kind of lines of inquiry that we came up with. So it might be, say you're talking about animals and the environment. So you might be looking at that there's the lines of inquiry that your students discovered could be about endangered animals or invasive species, climate change, pollution, human impact on the environment, what the things that we do. If those are the lines of inquiry that you previously discovered, you can kind of put those, so I put those up for my students, and just with that word in the center of a chart paper, and I circle it. And then we brainstorm, and I might do a graffiti write or other activities where students just wander around the room and fill up the chart paper with all of their ideas. But on those chart papers, we put what are the specific things that relate to that? What are the topics that somebody can look into and dig deeper? So say you have a student that's like, oh, okay, and I love animals, so I'm going to go into and look more at endangered animals. Okay, so now they've narrowed it down from, say, 5 topics to 1. But there's a lot of endangered animals, so they can't just look at saving every animal or taking action on every endangered animal. They need to narrow it down to 1 endangered animal. So they're going to have to do a little bit of research about what animals are endangered. So they do a little bit of preliminary research. Maybe they have an idea. Maybe there's some ideas on the chart paper about what animals are endangered. So they'll pick maybe 4 types of animals. They'll narrow it down. And they'll say, okay, what type of animals could I pick? Well, I pick an elephant or a sea turtle or a rhinoceros or an orangutan. So maybe those are the 4 animals that interested them the most. So then they have to look even deeper. They have to start looking they have to pick. They have to really evaluate and reflect on those 4 ideas. Which one is the most interesting to them? Which of them makes them the most excited or the most passionate? Which one is good research? Some of the topics just don't have research. So it makes it really not a very valid inquiry project because they're going to struggle through the research. Now, that's not to say they can't do that topic, but they're going to have to think and plan for that. How are they going to get that research? And also, do they have any background knowledge in it already? They might want to have a little bit of knowledge already before they look to dig deeper. So then I want them to start going, so maybe they pick the sea turtle. Then I want them to start working backwards about asking questions. So the whole point is they want to save the sea turtle. Great, that's the action item that they're going to do, which happens at the end of inquiry, which is taking action based on what you've learned. So if they know the end is they want to save a sea turtle, well, now they can work backwards from there using questioning to help them to piece out the information that they might need to know. So they need to understand, why do they need saving? What problems might be facing the sea turtle? What can I do to help it? What is already being done for that sea turtle? So they need to start asking questions about saving the sea turtle that allows them to help guide their specific research on how to save a sea turtle. What's already being done? Why do they need saving? Even more so, that's a great time to conference with the student to help them to find out other questions that might get them to be a little bit more specific, such as, are they looking at a specific species of sea turtle? There's more than one. Where are they located? What do they need to know about more information about the turtle? So constantly looking at your, like the onion, you're uncovering layers upon layers and helping them to get more and more specific. And eventually they can come up with, how are they going to save a specific type of sea turtle by doing a specific type of action? And through their research, then they can then present and share with others the actions that can be taken by them as students that could potentially save a sea turtle, which aligns with what they have chosen to be passionate about. So it's really about starting with those big ideas and helping them to narrow it down and whittle down their topic into something very specific that they can take action on and do something about, and conferencing with them through that process to help get them there. And I think little by little, those questions help to guide their research. The key there is that this is their research. It's their project. So it's what they have decided. It's what they have picked. And that means that they're most likely going to be a bit more passionate. Now, we want to allow them a variety of ways. Just like they picked their topic, we want to give them a variety of ways that they can then present and share their knowledge, not just one way. Now, because they're doing this and you're conferencing with them, what you're not doing is you're not designing the specific project that every student in your class needs to complete, which generally is probably done either during your prep or at home, where you're coming up with these amazing ideas that you think your students will absolutely love. So my challenge for you is, how can you use that questioning to get them to do an independent project, and also getting them to move forward and choose things themselves and doing less teacher-directed and more student-centered approaches in inquiry. And I think the key there is really focusing on questioning and helping your students to dig a little bit deeper and looking at those big ideas that they need to cover. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining me. If you would like to catch this show live or previous episodes, so other replay episodes, you can find those at www.teachingwithinquiry.com. You can also catch this show on replay either through YouTube or a podcast, so you can take it with you on the go. And that is all for me tonight. And the blog post will be on www.madlylearning.com. Okay, now that's everything for me tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. I hope that you use questioning more often in your classroom to help with inquiry. Have a great night. See you next week.